A Frontier Society in Transition, 1876 to 1886. Following the Civil War, Texas was still a frontier society. The majority of the population lived in rural areas, and the predominantly male population retained a frontier mentality. However, signs that the state was moving towards modernity included the formation of new towns, increase in miles of railroad track laid, the growth of labor unions, and the innovations in education. The population grew significantly during the post-war era. Most immigrants came to Texas from the devastated South. With the pacification of the Indian peoples and their confinement on reservations, cattlemen, farmers, and their families and railroad lines were soon pushing westward. South Texas also looked promising. Cheap land and cheap labor. A small but significant influx of American and European civilians included such men as Milton Kennedy and Richard King, who became wealthy independent ranchers. Slowly there was a transition towards commercial farming as South Texas acreage was converted to farmland. Unfortunately, fraud played a significant role in the process as many Mexican grantees were dispossessed of their lands. Farmers also pushed westward, as new railroads lured many to new centers of commerce such as Abilene, Sweetwater, Big Spring, Midland, Odessa, Amarillo, and Lubbock. Sheep ranching was introduced into the Wild Horse Desert, but did not thrive in the region until the 1870s, and then was short-lived. Overgrazing, severe drought, hard freezes, and drops in the price of wool weakened the industry in South Texas. The sheep and goat industry, as well as the cattle industry, then moved into the Edwards Plateau, where it became a major producer of sheep and wool. It was also an ideal region in which to raise Angora goats. Texas was second only to California in the number of sheep in 1886. Violence and vigilantism impacted the Tejano community. Raids by Mexican nationals upon thousands of unbranded cattle that roamed the area between the Neches River and the Rio Grande led to the cattle wars, which lasted until the late 1870s. Many peaceful Mexican farmers and ranchers were also victimized. Harassment and persecution increased as a direct result of Caterino Garza's attempt to use South Texas as his base for launching a revolution against Mexican President Porfirio Diaz. Other acts of violence were demonstrated in the Salt War and the Rio Grande City riot of 1888. Texas Rangers, often overstepping the very laws they sought to enforce, aided in collecting taxes, protecting prisoners from vigilante mobs, maintaining the peace during sensational court cases, monitoring elections, mediating labor strikes, and enforcing quarantines against disease. They also tracked down outlaws and protected the frontier. With over 61 million acres in public lands in 1876, Texas created the Permanent School Fund and set aside over 42 million acres for public education. The legislature, with the encouragement of Governor Oren Roberts, passed two laws in 1879. The first set the sale of school land at $1 per acre with a limit of 4 sections, while the second act, the so-called 50-cent law, allowed the sale of unappropriated public domain with no limits on quantity purchased. Public dissatisfaction with Roberts' policies led to the end of land grants to the railroads and the creation of the short-lived State Land Board to reclassify public lands and guarantee the settlers received priority over speculators. Administrators of public domain remained a problem for Roberts' successor, John Ireland, who won the gubernatorial nomination on his opposition to railroad land grants. Introduction of barbed wire and windmills eventually led to fence-cutting wars and vigilantism. It was evident that the state had failed to carefully manage its public domain. Foreign investment, in particular, irritated small farmers who saw the gathering of so much land to railroads and large ranches as punitive. Labor unionization got a foothold in Texas shortly after the Civil War, but cultural assumptions such as individualism and the scarcity of private property impeded its growth. Longshoremen were the first to organize, seeking to gain health benefits and financial aid for ill workers in 1866. 16 years later, black longshoremen, under the guidance of Norris Wright Cunning, organized their own union. Unionization made little headway into the lumbering camps, advancing slowly despite the national success of the Knights of Labor. Many farmers endorsed the graduated income tax and the direct election of U.S. senators, but balked at endorsing labor union goals. Even though the Knights did not advocate strikes, there was 100 strikes in Texas between 1881 and 1885 that were led by the Knights and involved cowboys on the West Texas ranches, dock workers in Galveston, stone cutters during the Capitol boycotts, and railroad workers. In Chicago, Texan Albert R. Parsons was convicted and eventually executed for inciting the Haymarket Square riot. Associations with violent episodes of radical leaders hurt the Knights, and by 1893 the Union had only a few thousand members. Although Texas remained overwhelmingly agrarian, cities began to swell. San Antonio led the way in terms of growth. The four other largest cities were situated in the eastern half of the state: Houston, Dallas, Galveston, and Fort Worth. However, as late as 1900, Texas cities lagged behind other U.S. towns in urban and industrial development, but also lacked tenement housing, systems of mass transportation, and visible European ethnic enclaves. Education had long been seen as the responsibility of local communities. Therefore, inadequate and unequal educational opportunities prevailed. It was not until 1884 that public indignation forced the state legislature to completely reorganize the public school system. The present-day problem of equal and viable tax bases began. Rural areas did not fare well, although higher education fared better. The first public college, the Agricultural and Mechanical College, opened its doors in 1876. The University of Texas was chartered in 1839, but the Civil War, Reconstruction, and controversies over public lands delayed its opening until 1883. Since Texas A&M could admit no black students by law, the legislature provided funding for a Negro agricultural college that initially emerged as Prairie View Normal Institute in 1879, a college for training teachers. Sam Houston State Normal School opened in 1879 in Huntsville, admitting only white students. The prevailing philosophy was that public funds would not be used to provide charitable and benevolent institutions. However, a handful of institutions for the mentally ill, blind, deaf, and orphaned were established in the late 1880s. State prisons were a different story. The prison population exploded. Convict leasing prevailed. The Republican Party peaked during Reconstruction. Norris Wright Cunny claimed leadership of the party upon the death of E.J. Davis. Race still mattered, and many resented black Texans' domination of the party. White factions often used intimidation and election fraud to preclude the election of blacks to local offices. The Greenback Party was the first third party to challenge Democratic political dominance with an attractive platform that appealed to the downtrodden. Advocating an income tax, the Australian or secret ballot, and the direct election of U.S. senators on the national level, it appealed to the Texas agrarian radical element by endorsing railroad regulation, ceasing the practice of convict leasing, and the wholesale elimination of the useless state government offices. Fusion with the Republican Party made sense but ultimately failed. Shortly thereafter, the Greenback Party faded away from the Democratic Party, eventually split over the issue of prohibition, but the voices of reform continued to be felt throughout the 1880s. Texas was transformed in the last quarter of the 19th century as native people were displaced. The struggle for territorial supremacy had been international, but Anglo-Texans established their hold over the state once and for all. New technology pushed people westward, helped them exploit the land and natural resources, and then facilitated the transportation of crops and products to market. A self-confidence and individualism born in the frontier adventure developed. Its legacy was not all positive. Arrogance often expressed itself at the expense of others, namely racial and ethnic minorities. The push westward was also accompanied by violence, greed, and wastefulness. Both positive and negative attitudes persisted into the new industrial urban age that came with the new century.